السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Firstly, as a disclaimer, let me start by saying that I am really tired. I hardly got any sleep over the past 72 hours. I just returned from a journey. So the only reason why I'm teaching is because this was the practice of my asatidah, who in turn learned from their asatidah that they would just return from lengthy journeys and they would still attend durus. So they would never omit a lesson for trivial reasons. However, the only difference is that our asatidah, mashallah, they didn't need to prepare for a lesson. They didn't need to make mutala'ah. They could just travel the whole day and then come straight to lessons and deliver the most detailed lesson. But I'm not on that level, so if it sounds like I'm talking all mixed up, then let me know, and inshallah, then I will repeat the lesson. So at least we get the barakah of attending the dars today. So we concluded the last part discussing the narrations which all link to the Prophet ﷺ. So such narrations are called marfu'. Now it's really important to know what qualifies as marfu' and what is not considered as marfu', because this here forms the basis of knowing from which narrations you can derive legal rulings. Isn't if it's the words of the Prophet ﷺ, then it's definitely more powerful than if it is the words of anyone else. So that means if there's contradiction, then obviously you will know that these are the words of the Prophet ﷺ, hence it takes preference over the words of a sahabi. Then we explained that these narrations could take numerous different forms. They could be regarding the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, they could be regarding the actions of the Prophet ﷺ, and they could also be pertaining to the approval and the disapproval of the Prophet ﷺ. And then we also explained that such narrations could either be very clearly and explicitly attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, or they can be indirectly and implicitly attributed to him. So examples of all these were given. Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned examples, and all of them were mentioned in the last lesson. Now Ibn Hajar rahimahullah shares an example of an action which is indirectly attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. So here when an action is mentioned, although it's not mentioned from the Prophet ﷺ, but it will be like the Prophet ﷺ done it, and therefore when using for ihtijaj purposes, in order to derive it and use it as a dalil, then you know it has the same status as a marfu'. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah says, وَمِثَالُ الْمَرْفُوعِ مِنَ الْفَعْلِ حُكْمًا يَفْعَلَ. In the footnote you can see Shaykh Nuruddin Itr wrote that as-sahabi, in some nuskhas it comes, and even if it doesn't come, the meaning is clear, that يفعل الصحابي أو يفعل ما لا مجال للاجتهاد فيه فينزل على أن ذلك عنده عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، كما قال الشافعي في صلاة علي في الكسوف في كل ركعة أكثر من ركوعين. ومثال المرفوع من التقرير حكما أن يخبر الصحابي أنهم كانوا يفعلون في زمان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كذا، فإنه يكون له حكم الرفع من جهة أن الظاهر اطلاعه على ذلك لتوفر دواعيهم على سؤاله عن أمور دينهم، ولأن ذلك الزمان زمان نزول الوحي فلا يقع من الصحابة فعل شيء ويستمرون عليه إلا وهو غير ممنوع الفعل. وقد استدل جابر وأبو سعيد رضي الله عنهما على جواز العزل بأنهم كانوا يفعلونه والقرآن ينزل، ولو كان مما ينهى عنه لنهى عنه القرآن. So the first example he gives, he says an example of what will be of an action which is indirectly attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, is where a sahabi practices upon something which is not possible for the sahabi to come up with that on his own. So it's something which there will have to be someone who informed the sahabi or told the sahabi. A normal human intellect cannot make that up. And it also, we don't find it clearly mentioned as wahi in the Quran or from the very clear statements of the Prophet ﷺ. So if it's such an action where a sahabi is doing So for example, a Sahabi when performing wudu, he's performing the wudu in a certain way. Now no one can just sit there and decide, okay, today I want to make wudu like this, because then it will be bid'ah, it will be an innovation. So Sahaba were very particular to follow the Prophet ﷺ in everything that they done. They would make sure not to innovate anything in deen. So if they have to do something like this here, which cannot be made up by the human intellect, فَيُنَزَّلَ عَلَىٰ أَنَّ ذَلِكَ عِنْدَهُ مِنَ النَّبِيِّ صَلَى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم, it would mean that they got this from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is how Ibn Hajar rahmallah mentions it. So Mullah al-Qari say, أي مستفادا منه بأي وجه كان تحسينا للظن بالصحابة. That this here could be derived from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in whichever way. So whether the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam verbally said it, whether the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam practiced upon it. So the Sahabi saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam making wudu in that particular way, whether the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam maintained silence, in whichever way the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam it's derived from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Ibn Hajar rahmallah is placing this under the category of fi'al. He's saying that it is an action which has the ruling of a marfu' narration. So commenting on that, Allama Munawi rahmallah said, قال بعض من لقيناه يحتمل أن يكون من قوله. It's possible that the Sahabi could have got it verbally from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He could have heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioning it. And thereafter, Allama Munawi rahmallah quotes Allama Shumunni rahmallah is saying, كذا مثل المؤلف وخالفه الشمني فأنكر ذلك وقال لا يتألى فعل مرفوع حكما. That this year, it's not possible to say that you will even get an action which is indirectly attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the minute it's attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it will have to be clear. It's very clear that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam done it. So how can anything be implicitly or directly attributed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? He's saying that you don't even get a category like this to be again what. So he said, وَلَا يَلْزَمُ مِنْ كَوْنِهِ عِنْدَهُ عَنِ النَّبِيِّ صلى الله عليه وسلم أن يكون عِنْدَهُ مِنْ فِعْلِهِ لِجَوَازِ أن يكون عِنْدَهُ مِنْ قَوْلِهِ. And then also that the Sahabi practicing upon it, that does not mean that the Sahabi has definitely got it from the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's very possible that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told it to him, or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam verbally approved it. So therefore, he's saying that basically this whole category is invalid. مثال المرفوع من الفعل حكما. You don't get a concept as الفعل حكما. So Mullah al-Qari explains this objection and he says, واستشكل شارح بأنه يجوز فعل الصحابي ما لا مجال للاجتهاد فيه لسماعه منه صلى الله عليه وسلم. That maybe the person heard it from the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. Therefore, it ought to be from the category of al-qawl hukman, because he heard it. It's the verbal words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. لا لأنه عليه السلام فعله فلا يكون من مرفوع الفعل. So that's the objection. Allama al-Qani rahmallah responds to this objection and he said, ويمكن أن يقال عهد منه البيان بالقول والبيان بالفعل. It has been established that many times Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would either practically do something, or Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would verbally say something. وعهد من الصحابة نقل بيانه القول كما هو باللفظ. Likewise, it has been established from the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum that they would mention the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and maybe they would mention the exact words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, وإما بالمعنى على سبيل المحافظة والملازمة, or they would mention the meaning. فصار ما سكتوا عنه من الأفعال الصادرة عنهم التي لا مجال للرأي فيها محمولة على أنهم شاهدوا فعله إياها كذلك وإلا لسلكوا بها الجادة. He's saying that when the Sahabi is just practicing upon it without mentioning the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then by default it would mean that the Sahabi actually saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he's saying that it's like a context, that if the Sahabi had a statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then he would have mentioned it. It became the practice of Sahaba radiyallahu anhum. When they heard words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then they would mention that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us this. And when they didn't have clear words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even if they the meaning of the words, so if they didn't remember the precise words, they couldn't quote it verbatim, and then they would just practice, and this was how their methodology became. So this here is the response of Allama al-Qani rahmallah. However, Mullah al-Qari rahmallah presents a better response, and he's saying that actually the whole thing here, which they must understanding, is the focus is not on the action of the Sahabi. When we say marfu' fi'lan, when we're talking about the fi'l here, the focus is on the Sahabi and not on Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That we are looking that it's the Sahabi who done the action. Now this action which was done by the Sahabi, it goes into the category of marfu'. So the action is not of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and therefore he mentioned mustafad min ayyi wajhin kan, that in whichever way the Sahabi got it from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that makes no difference. That's immaterial. Here the whole focus is that the Sahabi is doing it. The Sahabi is the one carrying out the action. وهو مدفوع بأن المراد من المثال أن يكون فعل الصحابي له حكم المرفوع. It's the action of the Sahabi which has the حكم of مرفوع بألا يكون من تلقاء نفسه لاشتراط ما لا مجال للاجتهاد فيه، بل يكون مأخوذا منه عليه الصلاة والسلام، وهو أعم من أن يكون مستفادا من قوله أو فعله أو تقريره صلى الله عليه وسلم. So in short, this whole thing means that a Sahabi is doing an action which he got from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, immaterial how he got it from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whether the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam verbally told it to him, whether he saw that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam approved of it, did not object on it, or whether the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam practiced upon it. Now to present an example for this here, Ibn Hajar rahmallah says, كما قال الشافعي في صلاة علي في الكسوف في كل ركعة أكثر من ركوعين. So he's saying like how Imam Shafi'i rahmallah mentioned with regards to the salah of Ali radiyallahu anhu. So you can see here again, it's the action of Ali radiyallahu anhu. That means maybe there was an eclipse again during the era of Ali radiyallahu anhu after the demise of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now Ali radiyallahu anhu was the Imam. And in this case, Ali radiallahu anh is performing more than 2 rukus in every rakat. So obviously we're not discussing the masala here. We're looking at the fiqh rule. We're not discussing the fiqh ruling. We're looking here at the istidlal of Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah. So this is what Ibn Hajar rahimahullah mentioned. In the footnotes, if you have to look at the reference which is given to this here, you will find that it's Shaykh Nuruddin did not attribute it to Imam Bayhaqi rahimahullah. But when you go to commentaries, you will find that they quote this here from Sunan al-Kubra of Imam Bayhaqi and from al-Madkhal. Now, when going to Sunan al-Kubra of Imam Bayhaqi, then you will find that Allama Baqa'i rahimahullah, he assumed that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is referring to the following narration, which between Imam Bayhaqi and Imam Shafi'i, there are 3 links. So Imam Bayhaqi narrates from Abu Sa'id ibn Abi Amr, who narrates from Abu al-Abbas, who narrates from Rabi', who then narrates from Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah. So you can see it's from Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, and then from Abad, who narrates from Asim al-Ahwal. That now he mentions that Ali radiyallahu anh, annahu salla fi zalzalatin. So there's an earthquake. But there's a huge difference between an earthquake and between an eclipse. It's totally different. So, you hear this, when you go to Sunan al-Kubra, you find that it's actually talking about an earthquake. That in that, Ali radiallahu anhu made multiple rukus. And thereafter he mentions the statement of Imam Shafi'i as saying, وَلَوْ ثَبَتَ هَذَا الْحَدِيث عِنْدَنَا عَنْ عَلِيٍّ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ لَقُلْنَا بِهِ. So this here is what's mentioned in the Sunan al-Kubra, and it's also mentioned in Ma'arifat al-Sunan wal-Athbat, same sanad, and at the same statement of Imam Shafi'i rahmallah. So hence, Allama Baqa'i rahmallah now makes an objection here, and he says, أَظُنُّ قَوْلَ الْمُؤَلِّفِ فِي الْكُسُوفِ وَهْمًا. I think that maybe this here is a slip up from Ibn Hajar. Obviously, it's his ustad, his teacher, Ibn Hajar rahmallah, that he says that I assume that maybe my teacher made a slip up here by mentioning that Imam Shafi'i's statement is with regards to Salatul Kusuf. Rather, it's with regards to Ali radiallahu anh performing at the time of an earthquake. وَإِنَّمَا هُوَ فِي الزَّلْزَلَةِ. And thereafter he mentions these 2 narrations from Ali radiallahu anh. And then he says, وَأَمَّا الْكُسُوفُ فَقَدْ رُوِيَ أَنَّ فِي كُلِّ رَكْعَةٍ أَكْثَرَ مِنْ رُكُوعَيْن مِنْ فَعْلٍ عن فعل النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أيضا في عدة طرق. So like we said, that we're not discussing the fiqh ruling. So this is the objection of Alama Baqa'i rahimahullah. That Ibn Hajar is mentioning that and attributing that Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah mentioned with regards to the Salah of Ali to an eclipse, but the reality is that it's actually with regards to an earthquake. And Alama al-Qani rahimahullah, he supported this objection. However, it is very probable that maybe Ibn Hajar rahimahullah is referring to another narration which Imam Bayhaqi rahimahullah narrated under the chapter of eclipse. ويذكر عن الحسن البصري أن علي رضي الله عنه صلى في كسوف الشمس 5 ركعات و4 سجدات. And thereafter he mentions it with the sanad to Rabi' who says قال الشافعي حكاية عن هشيم عن يونس عن الحسن بذلك ويذكر عن علي رضي الله عنه 4 ركعات في ركعة و4 ركوعات في ركعة. So this narration is very clearly mentioned under the chapter of man Ijāzah yusalla fil khusufi rak'atain. So kusuf is basically solar eclipse, lunar eclipse, same difference. Fi kulli rak'atin salat ruku'at. So basically the crux of this here is that Ibn Hajar did not give the source of the statement, what he's attributing to Imam Shafi'i. Maybe if Shafi'i is to go through all the books of Imam Shafi'i, rahmallah, you might find another statement. But what the commentators have mentioned with regards to Sunan al-Kubra, and a ma'rifah to Sunan, that might not be correct. Then also, this here doesn't even conform with the madhab of Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah. And therefore, Mullah al-Qari rahimahullah mentioned, وَلَعَلَّ هَذَا قَوْلٌ فِي مَذْهَبِهِ. Probably this is just one view within the Shafi'i madhab. وَإِلَّا فَالْمَشْهُورُ مِنْ مَذْهَبِهِ وَهُوَ قَوْلُ مَالِكِ وَأَحْمَدِ فِي كُلِّ رَكْعَةٍ رُكُوعًا. Like how in the madhab of the Hanbali madhab and the Maliki madhab, there is only 2 rukus in every rakat. So there is no, from the 4 imams, there is no imam who says that there will be more than 2 rukus in 1 rakat. Because according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahmallah, it's only 1 ruku. And according to them, it is 2 rukus. So there is no madhab which says more than 2 rukus. So he says that قال في الأنوار وهو كتاب مشهور في مذهب الشافعي أقل صلاة الخسوف والكسوف ركعتان في كل ركعة قيامان وركوعان. So ولا يزاد ولا ينقص ولو زيد أو نقص عاملا بطل. So you can see that it's not even permissible within the Shafi'i madhab to make more than 2 rukus. So basically the statement or what Imam Ibn Hajar is referring to, it has to be a source, that the exact statement and the exact words of Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah. So like we mentioned, that besides this here, all the narrations which describes the where the Sahabi is making wudu, and then someone describes the wudu of a Sahabi, or they describe the Salah of a Sahabi, all that will be would refer under the Siyah. It would all be considered as marfu' but hukman, that it's an action of a Sahabi which is indirectly attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, because it's most definite that the Sahabi would have gotten that from the Prophet ﷺ. Then Ibn Hajar rahmallah gives an example which shows that the Prophet ﷺ indirectly approved of something. So he says, وَمِثَالُ الْمَرْفُوعِ مِنَ التَّقْرِيرِ حُكْمًا. The Prophet ﷺ is not clearly mentioned in the narration that the Prophet ﷺ approved of this, or the Prophet ﷺ did not object, because that goes under tasrihan. Yeah, it's just that indirectly we understand that the Prophet ﷺ did not disapprove of this action. So he says, أَيُخْبِرَ الصَّحَابِيُّ أَنَّهُمْ كَانُوا يَفْعَلُونَ فِي زَمَانِ النَّبِيِّ صلى الله عليه وسلم كذا. So he says that if a Sahabi has to mention that they done a particular action in the era of the Prophet ﷺ, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So these words, fi zamani Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, these words are qeyd ihtirazi. It's definite, they must add these words, that they done it in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. We'll explain all of that a bit later. Allama Munawi rahmallah adds more examples. He says, or if they mention that kunna naf'alu kadha, or nara kadha, or kunna ma'ashir an-nas naf'alu fi ahdihi. So they have to mention kunna naf'alu fi ahdi Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. They have to add that. They have to clearly mention that it was in the era of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. All of these words, Likewise, he mentions, even if a Sahabi have to say, كُنَّا لَا نَرَى بَأْسًا, and then he says, فِي حَيَاةِ الْمُصْطَفَى عَلَيْهِ أَفْضَلُ الصَّلَاةِ وَالسَّلَامِ, or وَرَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم فِينَا, or رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم بَيْنَ أَظْهُرِنَا. So these type of words, there must be indication that it was in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because it could happen that the Sahabi does something after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away. So Kamal ibn Abi Sharif, he also says, وَمِثْلُهُ مَا لَوْ قَالَ عَلَىٰ عَهْدِ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم وَمَا بِمَعْنَاهُ. Anything which has this kind of a meaning to indicate that it happened in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if a Sahabi mentions that they would do something in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, فَإِنَّهُ يَكُونُ لَهُ حُكْمُ الرَّفْعِ مِنْ جِهَةِ an-Naḍar اطِّلَاعُهُ عَلَى صلى الله عليه وسلم على ذلك. Then such a narration will also have the ruling of a marfu' narration. Why will it have a ruling of a marfu' narration? Because it would it's apparent that the Prophet ﷺ would definitely come to know about it. But now we believe that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not alimul ghaib. So how can we say that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would come to know about it? لِتَوَفُّرِ دَوَاعِيهِمْ عَلَى سُؤَالِهِ عَنْ أُمُورِ دِينِهِمْ. Sahaba were not like us, that we first do something and then we go and inform, or maybe we do something behind closed doors. Sahaba were open books. They would most definitely go and ask the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The minute they heard something, they would go to the majlis of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and ask him. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was also very accessible. So that's the one reason that how we would know that Prophet ﷺ would come to know, just from the habit and the practice of the Sahaba, that they would always go and ask and seek clarification from the Prophet ﷺ. ولأن ذلك زمان نزول الوحي. Also that time was a time when wahi was coming down. So even if the Sahabi, for whatever reason, did not inform the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would come to know, because wahi was Allah Ta'ala is the one who knows everything, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would inform the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. فلا يقع من الصحابة فعل شيء ويستمرون عليه. That Sahaba would not do something and then continuously practice upon it, إلا وهو غير ممنوع الفعل. Only and only they would not do such an action if it was prohibited. So only if it was permitted, if it was غير ممنوع, if it was not prohibited, then they would continue. If it was prohibited, the ayah of the Quran would be revealed, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would come to know, and Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam would then prevent them. So now Ibn Hajar is saying that this here is actually even the practice of the Prophet is actually even the practice of the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum. وقد استدل جابر وأبو سعيد رضي الله عنهما على جواز العزل. That the whole reason how Abu Sa'id and Jabir radiyallahu anh, so both of their narrations, it's very famous. It comes in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, that they regarded it as permissible to do azl. So في الأمة وإن لم يستأذن وفي الزوجة بإذنها, they regarded it as permissible to do azl. Why? بأنهم كانوا يفعلونه والقرآن ينزل. So obviously you do azl, it's done in absolute privacy behind closed doors, and and the Sahaba, there is no proof that Sahaba asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But how they said it's permissible? Because it had not been permissible, even though it was done behind closed doors, Allah Ta'ala would know about it, and therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would then prohibit. وَلَوْ كَانَ مِمَّا يُنْهَى عَنْهُ لَنَهَى عَنْهُ الْقُرْآنِ. Had it been prohibited, the Quran would have prohibited it. So as a side note, Mullah al-Qari rahmallah, he comments here and he says, وَفِيهِ إِشَارَةٌ لَطِيفَةٌ إِلَىٰ أَنَّ هَذَا كَأَنَّهُ تَقْرِيرٌ رَبَّانِيٌّ. That this here is also, there's a subtle indication that all the actions of Sahaba radiyallahu anhum got divine approval from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِمَاءٌ إِلَىٰ أَنَّ فَعَلَهُمْ مَرْضِيٌّ سُبْحَانِيٌّ. Whatever action they done, it is as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was pleased with the actions. فإن الله سبحانه وتعالى حبب إليهم الإيمان وزينه في قلوبهم وكره إليهم الكفر والفسوق والعصيان ولأن الله تعالى ارتضاهم لصحبة نبيه صلى الله عليه وسلم واختارهم لتقوية دينه وجعلهم خير أمة أخرجت للناس يأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر ولذا قال صلى الله عليه وسلم خير القرون قرني. The خير القرون قرني is the a hadith which Hanafis practice upon the most. So, and then he says, Ashabi kan nujum bi'ayyi muqtadaytum ihtadaytum, you can do takhrij of that narration. So this is this side, a note. Alama Munawi rahmallah, he presents another example of this here. So that's the one, kunna na'zil wal Quran yanzil. The second one is, kunna na'kul luhum al-khayl ala ahdi Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So we would eat horse meat in a time of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Now again, there's that whole fiqhi ikhtilaf, and whether it's used for jihad, etc. That's not the discussion now. So you use that, so that now becomes a marfu' narration. So this is narrated in Sunan Nasa'i and Sunan Ibn Majah. Likewise, Alama Munawi gives another example. Kunna idha sa'atna kabbarna wa idha nazalna sabbahna. When we would ascend, when we would go up, then we would read Allahu Akbar. And then we were descending and we were walking down from somewhere, then we would read Subhanallah. Now here, you may have noticed in this example, he just mentioned what they would do. So he did not mention that it was in that time of the Prophet ﷺ. And we stress that it has to be in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Ibn Hajar said, fi zamani Nabi ﷺ. So it's actually in a narration of Sunan al-Nasa'i. In Bukhari it comes as kunna idha sa'adna kabbarna wa idha nazalna sabbahna. But in Sunan al-Nasa'i it's proven that it was in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Imam Nasa'i rahmallah narrates with his sanad, which goes to Ash'ath, which goes to Hasan, that Jabir radiallahu anhu said, kunna إذا كنا مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في سفر فصعدنا كبرنا وإذا انحدرنا صبحنا. So you can see that clearly. It shows that we were with the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم on a journey. So obviously it's in the presence of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. And it's important to mention this here because there were scholars before Ibn Hajar rahmallah who clearly mentioned that if it's not attributed to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, then it will not be considered as a marfu' narration. Ibn Hajar rahmallah got this here from Alama Ibn Salah rahmallah, and he in turn took it from Alama Khatib rahmahullah. So therefore, Alama Munawi rahmallah said, "Amma idha lam yudhifhu ila zaman an-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, fahuwa mawquf." If it just says kunna, like if we done this here, and they don't say we done it in the time of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, then it would be considered as a mawquf narration. It would just be considered as an action of a sahabi. Therefore, if you get actions of other sahaba, then you would have to look at qara'in on which one to prefer. If you get action of the Prophet ﷺ, then you prefer the marfu' narration, etc. It will be treated as a mawquf narration if it is not clearly attributed to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And he mentions that this here is the view of Imam Nawawi rahmallah and Ibn Salah rahmallah. Imam Nawawi rahmallah actually mentions that it's the view of majority of the muhaddithin and fuqaha and the ahlul usul. However, there were some usuliyun from the Shafi'is, Fakhruddin al-Razi and Alama Amidi, and also Imam Hakim rahimahullah, who felt that even if they didn't attribute it to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, then too it would be considered as a marfu' narration. So the minute a sahabi says kunna naf'al, even if it's not attributed to the Prophet at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, then it's considered as a marfu' narration. Imam Hakim rahmallah, he said, هذا باب كبير يطول ذكره بالأسانيد فمن ذلك ما ذكرنا ومنه قول صحابي المعروف بالصحبة. He mentions all words, like for example, from amongst the words he mentions وكنا نفعل كذا وكنا نقول وكنا لا نرى بأسا بكذا كان يقال كذا وكذا. So all these kind of words وأشباه ما ذكرناه إذا قال الصحابي المعروف بالصحبة فهو حديث مسند, and a musnad narration is a marfu which is muttasil. So therefore, Imam Hakim and Alama Fakhruddin Razi and Alama Amidi, they held a different view. They regarded it in all cases it will be considered a marfu' narration. However, Ibn Hajar rahmallah, he chose the same view like Ibn Salah rahmallah. Ibn Salah rahmallah in his muqaddamah he mentioned أحد أقول صحابي كنا نفعل أو كنا نقول كذا إن لم يضفه إلى زمان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فهو من قبيل الموقوف وإن أضافه إلى زمان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, then he first mentions the view of Imam Hakim, and after that he mentions and also Imam Hakim rahmallah got it from he says وبلغني عن أبي بكر البرقاني أنه سأل أبا بكر الإسماعيلي الإمام عن ذلك فأنكر كونه من المرفوع. So Abu Bakr Ismaili, who wrote the Mustakhraj on Sahih Bukhari, he also was of the view that it will be considered as mawquf. But he's saying والأول هو الذي عليه الاعتماد, that the first view that is considered as marfu' that is the correct view. As for the Hanafi view, we let Ibn Salah rahmallah himself tell us the Hanafi view. So in his book on Usul al-Fiqh, Allama Ibn Salah rahmallah mentioned, and he said, إذا قال الصحابي أو التابع كانوا يفعلون كذا حمل ذلك على الجماعة دون الواحد منهم وهو قول أصحاب حنيفة وذلك نحو قول عائشة رضي الله عنها كانوا لا يقطعون في الشيء التافه وقال إبراهيم النخعي كانوا يحذفون تكبير حذفا فيكون هذا عن جماعتهم لأن الصحابي والتابع إذا قال كانوا يفعلون كذا فإنما يقول ذلك على وجه الدلالة على صحة ما فعلوا. So this is the whole reason. When he's saying that we used to do this, why would he say that we used to do this? Because he wants to show that we used to do it, so it's something which is correct. فإذا كان كذلك وكانت الجماعة التي فعلها so he's saying that when they would do it like this here, it shows that even if they do not attribute it to the prime. So basically the Hanafis choose the same view like Imam Hakim, Abu Bakr, Ismaili. That it's the view of whenever a Sahabi says it, it's attributed. It is as if it's from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now all this here which is mentioned is just broad principles. Here whatever we're mentioning is broad principles. When you actually come to the time of now applying these principles, you will find that there's no hard and fast rule. There's a whole lot of other things you have to look at, and there's a whole lot of you have to look at the context. So Shaykh Ibrahim al-Lahimi says والذي رأيته وجود التساهل كبير جدا في وقتنا الحاضر في الحكم برفع هذين القسمين فالحكم برفعهما على طرف اللسان دون إمعان النظر في ذلك مما حدا بعض الباحثين إلى القول بإغلاق هذا الباب وعدم الحكم برفع شيء منه وفيما ثبت من المرفوع من غير هذين القسمين غنية. So he's saying that basically there's no hard and fast rule for every narration. When the Sahabi mentions that we used to do it, even if they mention we used to do it in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there are a whole lot of other factors that you have to look at. So alhamdulillah, we managed to complete the dars. You know, they say that sometimes a teacher, actually all the time, the teacher gets inspired according to the students. So through your sincerity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it easy for us to complete this dars. Inshallah, we'll continue on Thursday. Until then, jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.